In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create your own box PvP map. All of the code for the game mechanics, as well as an additional 16 free powers, can be found in the description below. But first, I just launched my brand new map creation package, and it's called Map Academy. It includes a fully inclusive box PvP course with over 40 unique and customizable powers. On top of this, you can learn how to replicate current successful map trends, such as immersive first-person zombies and encapsulating tycoons. So whether you are a beginner who is looking to get started in Fortnite game development, or an experienced creative looking for a cheaper alternative to the thousands of dollars map agencies charge, check out the package that is linked in the description, and I promise you will not be disappointed. Anyways, let's get right into the tutorial. Okay, so once you've opened your blank project, the first thing you want to do is hit Verse Explorer. You want to right click on your project name and click Add New Verse File to Project. The first device that we're going to add is going to be called Game Start, and hit Create Empty. Now I'm going to do this two more times. One called Ability Button Manager. And the other called Basic Functions. Now, I'm going to go ahead and open up these verse files. You can either double click or hit the first button. Here, you'll see all of your 3 verse files you just created, except they're all empty. If you go into the description below and join my Discord server, you can find all of the verse code that I'm going to use in this project completely for free. Once you find the game start file underneath the box PvP content, you want to copy everything from that file into the new one that you created in your project. Once you finish copying it over, go ahead and do the same thing for the other 2 files. Now that you have all 3 files copied over, you can go ahead and minimize the verse and hit Verse Build Verse Code. Once you've done this, a Creative Devices folder should appear in your content browser. You can open this up and you'll see all 3 verse devices that you just created. You can go ahead and drag these onto the play space. The first device that we're going to fill out is going to be the Basic Functions device. It only has one option. This is a damage amplifier. It is just used for some of the power-ups to be able to reduce repetitiveness. The settings you need to change in this are you can turn off ambient audio, turn on respawn and change the time to 0, and also scroll down to effects and change this to none. Now that I'm done filling out those settings, I'm going to just change the name of the power-up to keep it more organized and call it Basic Damage Increase. Now you can go back into the device and select this damage amp. That's it for the Basic Functions device, so I'm going to go ahead and move this out of the way. The next device that I'm going to go over is the Game Start device. This has a few options, the first of which is the full class selector list. This is a list of class selectors that will be used to switch players to at the start of the game. So to add this, we'll find a class selector and drag it into the play space. First, turn on class to switch to and change class slot to 1. Next, you can disable visible in-game, zone audio, and activation audio, as well as display VFX effect on activation, and volume visible in game. Once you have these settings filled out, you want to create as many class selectors as powers in your box fight map. Fortnite only allows 16 classes, as you can see, so in this case, I'm just going to make 16 class selectors. Let's go ahead and do this. As you can see, I went ahead and made all 16. The last thing you need to do is actually change which class slot each class selector switches to. So the first one, I'm going to keep as class slot 1, the second, 2, the third, 3, and so on. Once you have the class selectors completed, we now need to make class designers for each of the corresponding classes. So to do this, search for class designer and drag one into the play space. The first thing you need to do in the class designer is enable the class identifier and change it to class slot 1. Now you have lots of options that you can change on a class by class basis. These options can include the max health and max shields that the player has, a movement multiplier to determine how fast the player moves, even gravity. Underneath these settings is the item list. This is the list of items that your player is going to be granted on spawn. So to do this, I'm going to add elements to the array. Click on the drop down, change what item I want the class to have. So here I'm just going to give them a purple pump shotgun. And I only want them to have one of the item. And now I'm going to do that a few more times. So as you can see, I gave them a shotgun, an assault rifle, some ammo, some materials, and some heals. If you want to change what items a class has, for example, giving them a full mythic inventory, this is where you'll change that. For now, I'm going to leave this setting alone, but we'll come back to it later whenever I'm showcasing how to add some of the powers. There's a lot more settings you can change lower down in the class designer, but none of them are actually necessary at this point. So the next step is to actually duplicate this designer for every single one of your selectors. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now that I have all 16, I want to do the same thing as I did with the class selectors and change each of the class slots to their corresponding number. Okay, now that I've finished filling out the class slots for each of the designers, I have one more step that I need to do, and that's to make HUD messages for every single one of these classes. So, go into your content browser and search for a HUD message device. Here you want to copy these settings. Change message recipient to triggering player. Turn off show for duration. Change the placement to custom. The screen anchor to center left. And turn off priority. Also select the sound and press clear. Change both the intro animation and outro animation to none. And everything else you can leave alone. Just like the other two devices, we want 16 of these for each of the classes. So, duplicate them. Once you've made 16, you now want to actually make the widgets for each of these HUD devices. To do this, I'm going to make a new folder in our content browser, and I'm going to call it HUD widgets. Open this up, right click, go user interface, and press widget blueprint, and click user widget. I'm going to title this HUD 1 and open it up. Now that I have the blueprint open, I'm going to drag a canvas panel onto the screen. This will act as the player's screen. I'm going to drag an image onto this. I'm going to change the anchors to left center, just like we selected in the HUD message device. And now I'm going to change this image to an image I have imported. Now that I have my image selected, I'm going to go ahead and scale this and move it in the position that I want. Ensure that because this is HUD 1, it corresponds with class 1's powers. Once you have this image where you want it, you go ahead and click compile, and you can close out of this blueprint. You can now copy this blueprint 16 times for all 16 classes. Once you have them duplicated, you can go ahead and open each widget and change the image to the image that you have dedicated for that class. After you've changed your image, make sure to hit compile. Once you've changed the images in all of your HUD blueprints, you want to go into the HUD message devices you created, scroll down until you find the HUD widget, and change it to the corresponding blueprint you created. So, because this is our first device, I'm going to select HUD 1, the second HUD 2, and so on. Once you've changed these widgets, you're now ready to go back into your game start device and fill out the full class selector list. So you want to add 16 elements for each of the classes you created. Now go into each of these elements and change these values. Because this is the first class, I'm going to change the class number to 1. The class selector, I'm going to change our first class selector. And the class HUD, I'm going to change to our first HUD message device. Do this, but for all 16 elements. Once you filled out each of these, you can now close out this array and move on to our next array of spawn barriers. These are the spawn barriers that surround each player during the countdown before the game starts. So to add this, you want to search for a barrier device and drag it onto the play space. The barrier material is up for you to decide. You can change it or even make custom if you want. I'm just going to change it to this translucent blue. The only other setting you need to change is the zone shape. Change it from box to hollow box so that players can actually be inside of it. You also probably want to change the barrier height to prevent players from going over the barrier. Before we get to duplicating this though, I want to go ahead and also add a player spawner. I'm going to position this player spawner right on top of the barrier. In this spawner, the only thing you need to change is disabling visible in game. I'm also going to go ahead and delete these other 2 player spawners that came with the island. So we have our first spawn location complete. I'm going to select both the player spawner and the barrier device and duplicate these for however many players you have in your game. In this scenario, I don't actually have a box, but obviously these spawn areas will be evenly spaced out within your box. So you want to make one of these for each of the players in your game. Typically, a box PvP has 12 players. Once you've completed all of these spawn pads, you can go right back into your game start and fill out both the spawn barriers and player spawner devices. So here I'm going to add 12 elements and select all of the barrier devices that I just created. I'm now going to do the same thing with the player spawners, selecting each player spawner as they go to the next element. Now that I completed these arrays, I'm going to go ahead and close them out, and we'll see you have one more option called the code HUD. I'm going to leave this alone for this tutorial, but this is just another HUD message device that if you want to create, it will apply to all players and can be used to show your map's code at the top of the screen. That's it for the game start device, so let's move on to our final device, the ability button manager. The first setting in the ability button manager is actually the game start, so we can go ahead and just select that. Below this, you'll see a list of all of the powers that are offered completely for free within the package. Before we actually go to filling these out, we're going to go back into our verse code. Back in the verse code, if you go to your ability button manager, you'll see there's a lot of commented out code below the game start device. Each of these are abilities that use buttons that are part of the free package. What you want to do is find the power that you want to add, and you want to uncomment it. So in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to add the spawn clones power. And once you uncomment it by highlighting it, holding control, and pressing /, you'll see you get an error. This is because we have to add the power to our verse file. So to do this, let's minimize this, click on Verse Explorer, and add a new verse file. And similarly to our last 3 verse files, we're going to name this the same thing as the spawn clones file in the box PvP content. So I'm going to title this spawn clones and click create empty. You're going to get verse errors, but that's okay. You can go ahead and mess it and close that out. Now back in the verse, you'll see the spawn clones file you just created. You want to copy everything over from the file available within the content into this new verse file you just created. Once you've copied this over, all of the errors in the ability button manager should now go away, and you want to scroll down and you want to find the power to player function. Under it, look for where it says spawn clones and you want to uncomment out these 3 lines of code. You're now done with this part of the verse. You can close out of it and hit verse, build verse code. Going back into our content folder, we'll have a new creative device called spawn clones that we can drag in. And here we have some options. The first option is clone player refs. This is an array of player references that will appear as the clones in this power. We can go in and drag this on, and you want to change the hologram effect strength to 0 so that it looks the most realistic. Other than that, you want to disable show base. Now that you have the reference created, you can go ahead and duplicate this around your box PvP. You can have as many as you want, but for now, I'm just going to place down 4. Moving on, the spawn clone sound will play whenever the player actually presses the button and activates their ability. I'm going to leave this blank for now, but obviously you can customize this however you want. The clone time, this is how long the clones will last. I'm going to make this 5 seconds. And the cooldown is how long the ability will be on cooldown for. So I'm going to change this to 30. The next 2 settings are the clone timer and the cooldown message. The clone timer is a timer device. So to add this, search for timer and you can drag the timer device into the play space. The duration doesn't matter because it'll actually just be affected by the cooldown time. The settings you do need to change is applies to player, completion behavior to reset, and display time, you can change to seconds only. Also, the timer running text, you can change this to something like cooldown so that the player knows what the timer means. Lastly, I'm going to change the name of this to maybe clone timer, just to be able to keep track of all the different timers that I'll have for each ability. I'm going to go ahead and select this. The last setting is another HUD message device. This will appear whenever a player tries to press the button, but their ability is on cooldown. So I'm going to make the message on cooldown. Change the message recipient to triggering player, and change the duration to just 2 seconds. You can also change the sound here as well as the placement. The last thing I'm going to change is the text color, and I'm going to make it red. I can now select the cooldown message as this HUD message device. First though, I forgot, I want to rename this the cooldown message so that it's easier to locate. Now I'm going to find cooldown message in these settings and select it. One thing to note is that you do need a new timer for every single power, but the cooldown message can stay the same. Now that I have the spawn clones device filled out for this ability, I can go back into our ability button manager and select the spawn clones device as the spawn clones device that we just filled out. I now want to scroll through the powers until I find our spawn clones power and change the select number to whatever class I want to have this ability. So in this example, I want the very first class to have the spawn clones ability. So I'm going to change this number to 1. But if I wanted, let's say class 6 to have this ability, I would just change this to class 6. Now there's a few more general settings that we have to fill out for the ability button manager. The first of which is the remote manager that will actually track whenever the remotes are pressed. So to find this, we'll see the remote manager and change the cooldown time to 0. You also need to change the signal remote tier. I'm going to change it to legendary. You can actually change this to any rarity you want as long as you equip the correct signal remote whenever you're changing the items in the class designers later. Now that this is done, we can select it in our ability button manager. The next options are all of our triggers. So we'll go ahead and search for trigger and drag one on. Here there's a few things you can change. First is disable visible in game. You also want to change activating class to class slot and 1. Now copy this trigger 16 times for each of your classes. Once you have all 16 created, Similarly to how we did the class selectors and designers, you want to change the class slot to the corresponding number for the class. So, trigger 1, I'll keep class slot 1. Trigger 2, change the class slot 2, and so on. Once you finish selecting class slots for each trigger, you can go back into your ability button manager and change each of these triggers to the corresponding trigger that you just created. The reason that we're using triggers is so that we can have more than 5 powers in the box PvP map. Because normally you're only limited to 5 button managers with 5 different rarities. Instead, we use triggers to bypass this. The last thing we need to do to make sure this ability works is go into our first class's class designer and give this class a remote so that they can actually activate their ability. Make sure, because we chose legendary as the rarity, I'm going to choose signal remote D. Now if I launch session, I'll be randomly assigned one of these classes and have the abilities that correspond with the class. Because for the other 15 abilities, I don't actually have powers yet, I'm going to go into the verse file, go into game start, and change this line of code right here, random gen. Instead of from 0 to class selectors length -1, I'm going to change this from 0 to 0. This is just to ensure that I actually get chosen as the first class so that I can properly test the ability. Make sure that if you interfere with this value to test specific classes, that you change it back to this initial code before you publish your game so that it properly chooses a random class. So now with 0, 0, ensuring that I'll get chosen as class 1, I'm going to hit verse build verse code and then go ahead and launch session to test it out. So now back in the game, if I press start, you'll see I get assigned the first class. I've got the remote manager, and if I press it, all of my clones appear, and they should only last 5 seconds before going away. So that covers how to make button abilities, but there's still 2 other types of abilities that I need to go over. The next type of ability I'm going to cover are the weapon abilities. These include things like freeze gun and the invisibility card. So to add this, the first thing you want to do is go into your Verse Explorer, right click, create a file, and name it the same thing as the file from the package. I'm going to show you how to create the invisibility card power. So I'm going to title this holding card invisible and click create empty. Just like the other devices, open up your verse and copy everything over from the other folder. Once you have that done, you go ahead and click verse build verse code and drag the new creative device into the play space. Here there's a few options. The first is going to be selecting the game start device. The second option is what class is going to have this ability. So I'm going to choose class number 3. We're actually 2 here. And now we have a conditional button. This conditional will check what item the player is holding and decide if the player is holding the card or something that's not the card. So to add this, let's find a conditional button. In the settings, the only thing that you really need to change is the key item and change this to any key card you want. It doesn't even have to be a key card. It can actually be any item. So you can make like an invisibility banana. It doesn't really matter. Once you have that selected, go back into your device and select this conditional button. The last thing we need to do is go to our class designer 2 and actually add the key card that we put in the conditional. Now that this is completed, I'm actually going to go back into the verse and go back to the game start verse file and change the get random int from 0 and 0 to 1 to 1 to make sure that I get chosen for the second class, just so I can test it out. Hit verse, build verse code, and then push changes. Alright, back in the game. If we press start, you can see that I'll get assigned the second class with the keycard, and if I hold it, I turn invisible. What's great about this is that the keycard will only work for the player who has the class selected. So if a different player picks up the keycard, they will not be able to turn invisible. The last type of ability I want to cover are abilities that don't actually require anything except a class number. So to do this, I'm going to showcase how to implement the double pump ability. First, I'm going to create a new verse file and title it double pump. Now that I have this created, I'm going to copy everything from the content double pump file into this new file that I just created. Now that this is done, I can exit out of the verse and go to the content browser, first hit verse and build verse code, and now in our creative devices, we'll have a double pump option. For this device, there's a couple settings that we need to fill out. The first is the game start. The second is the class selector. I'm going to change this class number to class number 1 so that whoever can spawn clones also has double pump. The next setting is a conditional button. I'm going to search conditional and add one to the play space. In this conditional, I'm going to go down until you find the key item and change this to the pump shotgun that you want the player to be able to double pump. I'm going to select the pump shotgun that I assigned every class earlier. Now go back into your double pump manager and select this conditional button that you just created. Afterward, we need a player marker device. I'm going to search for player marker and drag this into the play space. Here, you should disable show marker. After this, go into the item list and add the pump shotgun. You also want to disable visible for tracked player. Now that I have that selected, I'm going to go into our double pump and select the player marker. The last two settings are an item granter and an item remover. For the item granter, you want to change on grant action to keep all and add the pump shotgun to the item list. That's it for the item granter. For the item remover, all you need to do is disable play audio and add the pump shotgun to the item list. Now that both of these devices are finished, I can go back into our double pump and change the granter to the granter and the remover to the remover. Also, because the script is going to give the player the weapon, I'm going to remove the pump shotgun from class 1's inventory. Now I'm going to push changes and our double pump should work. Now you can see on class 1 as I have the signal remote and whenever I shoot my pump shotgun, it will remove it and instantly give me a new one. Now there's only two more things you need to do so that your box PvP map actually works properly. The first is the island settings. Go ahead and find your island settings and copy all of these settings. Okay, once you have your island settings set, the last thing you need to do is create a basic storm controller. This will act as your storm for the game. And here you can play around with these settings depending on how fast you want the storm to come in. Though if you don't know what you want to set these settings to, here are some basic settings that I would recommend. One more thing is to make sure to place this storm controller directly in the center of your box. Alright, that pretty much sums up this tutorial on how to make a box fight map. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video and you want more tutorials to release in the future. Also, let me know in the comments if there's any tutorials you guys specifically want me to create. Before I go, make sure to go into the description and check out Map Academy.